Hello and welcome back to the Polaris Travel Health Podcast. Thank you for tuning in with us this week. I'm Jason Kmet, and this week Jayden and I will be talking about mosquitoes, mosquito-borne illnesses, and so forth. So that's what we're going to do this week. Jayden?
Yeah, this is an exciting one. I think we wanted to do a bit of a deeper dive into mosquitoes. We chatted a little bit about a few other diseases before, but we thought we could kind of go a little bit further. So we've kind of touched a little bit on this before, like I mentioned, but what are kind of the major species or types of mosquito, and where can you kind of find each of them?
You can find mosquitoes just about everywhere when it comes right down to it. They are, I think there's thousands of different species. Even in North America, I think this is some advanced prep work you did, Jayden. It said 176 different variations in North America, which seems like a lot, but I wouldn't discount it when it comes right down to it. But I think the main ones that we really want to talk about and focus on, there's probably three big groups of mosquitoes. Now there's families, I guess you would call them.
Right.
The QX, the Anopheles, and the Aedes mosquitoes. Now, the QX mosquito is a mosquito, very common mosquito for our part of the world here. That's the kind of mosquito that can carry West Nile virus. In Asia, it can carry Japanese encephalitis. It's certainly a mosquito that we have a level of familiarity with. And it is one that, typically speaking, is more of a dusk and dawn biter and more successful, more active in more remote locations. It doesn't necessarily, like the city per se. Anopheles mosquito, that really is synonymous with malaria. That's sort of the main vector for malaria, typically speaking. And those mosquitoes are the ones that carry malaria, throughout tropical parts of the world. There are Anopheles mosquitoes that don't carry malaria, but for the purpose of what we're going to be talking about, that's going to be the main bit. And then the Aedes mosquitoes, which carry lots of things we don't like, things like yellow fever, dengue, Zika, chikungunya. These are mosquitoes which I think are always important to mention, that they are daytime biters and they like the city and they like people. So I think these are the ones where we don't really have much of them to speak of in our part of the world, but certainly these are mosquitoes that are problematic in a lot of warm weather places. And if anything, their range and reach is growing.
So why is it that you think that mosquito-borne illnesses are so common, aside from the fact that there's just so many of them? What is it about mosquitoes that makes them so good at spreading diseases?
I think that probably when you think about it, their close contact with the bloodstream, it just makes it easy for them to pass on a disease to humans, and with humans within humans, and humans to animals. And then you combine the fact that they can fly, which makes it easy for them to go further distances so that it's easier to spread. And yeah, they bite us. Like I said, especially the Aedes mosquitoes, they actually really quite like biting people. It's one of some of the other mosquitoes, they're less excited about biting people, even like QX mosquitoes in the reference to Japanese encephalitis. It's not, humans are not their favorite blood meal, but they'll make do. But yeah, so that's kind of, I think, where we're at right now with that.
Right. So one kind of like major disease that I personally think of when I think mosquito-borne illness would be malaria. So where are you kind of most at risk for it? And what are kind of like the symptoms and that sort of thing?
Okay. So as we mentioned already, malaria is carried by the Anopheles mosquito, and it's not a virus. I think a lot of people think that malaria is a virus. It's not. It's actually a parasite. So essentially what's happening is the mosquito is carrying that parasite and then essentially injecting it into your system. So what you're looking at there from locations, most deaths are in Africa, more specifically West Africa, but certainly all throughout Sub-Saharan Africa, maybe not so much in very limited parts of South America, but pretty much every place north of South America and south of the Sahara are considered high risk areas. And then you look into South America, certainly any kind of junglier areas in the Amazon, basin would be risk areas. And then also you look into Asia, and certainly there are quite a few areas in Asia which are at risk, mostly more tropical type areas. And typically in Asia, we find that it's a little bit more off the beaten path. Like certainly there's a lot of malaria, in Thailand, in Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, for example, but not usually in major centers. Like when I think of Africa, you can get malaria in a big city,
Right.
but in most major Asian cities, not as much, although quite a bit in some of the cities in India. And then the other place, which is places where we typically don't go, but are incredibly high risk, are a lot of Pacific islands. So a lot of obscure islands like this in Solomon Islands, that sort of thing. Those are some of the worst places in the world to get malaria. It's
Right.
just we don't very often go there. But if you're a World War II buff, places like Guadalcanal and those little islands there where the Americans and Japanese had a lot of battles, those are some of the worst places in the world to get malaria, even to this day.
Right. So what does kind of malaria look like when you get it?
Okay, so what happens with malaria, the really obvious thing is fever. It's flu-like symptoms and fever. But here's the thing that I think I always want to mention to people is it has a bit of a incubation period. So it's not like you get bit by the mosquito and later that afternoon you're running a fever and you feel terrible. It's usually a good week to 10 days after you've been bitten. So to sort of describe this in sort of this is not a very scientific way of explaining it, but this is how I like to explain it lots of times when I'm doing a consult. Think about it this way. So there's a mosquito, it's carrying the malaria parasite, it bites you, it injects the malaria parasites into your system. So at that point, some of those parasites are in your system, but essentially what they need is they need that week to 10 days to essentially grow and multiply in your body until a critical mass hits. And once there's a critical mass of the parasite in your bloodstream, in your system, then you start to feel sick. You get symptoms. You have a fever. You've got malaria. Well, you've had malaria for probably at least a week, but you're not really feeling the symptoms until that point. But here's the scary part of it with malaria is once you start to develop the symptoms, you're already quite sick.
Right.
So it's really important that if there's any suspicion of malaria, at that point, you're going to get followed up right away. One thing that we certainly see is that a lot of times we don't see malaria until a person returns from their trip. Think about it this way. I'm going to fill in the blank country in Africa, and I'm there for a couple of weeks, and everything is fine. But then I come back from my trip, and if you think about your incubation period of malaria is maybe 10 days, there's a very good chance that you're not going to feel sick until you get home.
Right.
And I think people always have to keep in mind that just because you didn't get sick while you were away is not necessarily a guarantee that you're home free. So that's something to always think about. And, I think that whenever you have a fever while you're in a malaria area, but even for several weeks afterwards, you want to, as soon as you have a fever, you got to get checked out. And I would say that, even if you're a person that is not as inclined to want to go see a doctor, I'd be like, this is something, maybe I'm being cautious, but last week I was in Ghana and now I'm back and I have a fever. Yeah. So that's kind of what you're looking at there. And, malaria can advance very rapidly and, it can cause organ failure. You can get cerebral malaria. It's definitely something that can kill you. But typically speaking, in a country like Canada with access to our medical care, if you have prompt treatment, you should survive.
Right. And what does that treatment kind of look like?
So there are medicines out there which are designed to kill the parasites. And there are several different factors on what we would give. Now, chloroquine has been used historically. Now, we don't use it as much now because of the fact that there's resistance. There are some other medicines out there available, things like atovaquone proguanil tablets, which is something that can be given and taken orally. Certainly for more advanced cases, there are these products, they're from the family of artemisinin-based drugs, and these are usually given by IV, and they're actually in Canada they require special access. You actually need to have it done up very specifically by an infectious disease doctor in a hospital setting. This is not something that your doctor could write you up a prescription and you could get a prescription filled for these meds at a pharmacy. So those are some of the things that we use, and they're pretty effective. The chloroquine, not so much, but the other ones are pretty effective at treating malaria.
Right, because the parasites have become resistant to the chloroquine, right?
Yeah. Chloroquine is really the original anti-malarial drug, and there's very few places in the world where it still actually works. Really, the only practical places that we would ever see an appointment would be that would get chloroquine would be into some of the Caribbean islands and Central America. For example, parts of Haiti, Dominican Republic, and into places like, Guatemala, Honduras. Those would be places where chloroquine still works, but it really doesn't work at all in Africa and in most of Asia. And in fact, in Asia, there's resistance to some other anti-malarial meds as well. So we don't see very much of chloroquine these days. It was a good drug, but the parasites have outsmarted it.
Right. How long did it take for them to become resistant to it? Like, how long has that been around?
Resistance has been around for a long time. I'd have to really look back on the history, but certainly those drugs were very effective for decades. But realistically, there's been chloroquine resistance in Africa for longer than I can remember. So it's not a new thing. It's not something that's happened in the last 10 years or anything like that. It's much longer than that.
Right. So there's also drugs that you can take before you go, correct? And they can help prevent malaria. Which ones are prescribed for which situations? Because when I was doing research for this, it seemed like there was so many different options.
Yeah. So here's what I would sort of start with. Now, as far as how the anti-malarial medicines work, they all work a little bit differently, but the concept is the same. So let's start with sort of the concept. So remember how I talked about the mosquito comes, bites you, injects the parasites in your system, and then it takes several days for them to grow and multiply.
Yeah.
So the concept here is, if you take anti-malarial medicines, usually you start taking it before you go into the high-risk area, while you're in the area, and then for a period of several days after you leave the area. Essentially, what you're doing is you have a low level of anti-malarial medicine already in your system. So if you get bit, and again, hopefully you don't get bit, but if you do get bit and parasites get injected into you, essentially that medicine's in your system already, and it can pretty much, pick off and kill the parasites, and they don't have a chance to do that whole grow and multiply thing.
Right.
You basically nip it in the bud, so to speak. And that's how all the anti-malarial medicines work. Now, the difference exactly how they work and the way you take them, that part is different. So really in Canada, we have 4 medicines that we have approved for as anti-malarials. Chloroquine is the first one to mention, and we've already talked about it a bit. Chloroquine is lovely in the sense that you have to take it only weekly. It is very well tolerated. We know even pregnant people can take it. And it's inexpensive, but it hardly works anywhere. So it's not typically too much a part of the conversation. So then we have the other 3 medicines, doxycycline, mefloquine, and atovaquone proguanil, which still goes by the brand name Malarone a lot. So really, you've got those 3 as the ones that work in most places in the world. So realistically speaking, my go-to is the Malarone, atovaquone proguanil. Now, there's a few reasons why it's my go-to. First one is there's no resistance anywhere. So that's always a bonus. The second thing about it is it's easy to take. You have to take it daily, but you only have to start taking it a day before you go into the high-risk area, every day while you're in the high-risk area, and for 7 days after you get out of the high-risk area. And it's well tolerated. The main side effect is stomach upset, and usually I advise taking it with food, but there's no major drug interactions, not very many other concerns from that standpoint. So in a lot of ways, all things being equal, super easy to take as long as you can sort of do the daily thing. But price is an issue. It is the most expensive anti-malarial. So you look around at another option. So doxycycline, also daily. You take it every day starting the day before you get there, while you're there, but you have to take that one for 4 weeks after you get out of the area. Generally speaking, reasonably well tolerated, can be upsetting to the stomach as well. The couple problems with this one is doxycycline can cause sun sensitivity. I kind of joke around about how it's like negative SPF 10, so to speak. Like, it does make you more sun sensitive. So that can certainly be a consideration depending on where you're going and what your activities are going to be. And then the other side effect that is a concern is if you're taking it for a lengthy period of time, which usually you have to, it can cause yeast infections, which not something that you typically want to deal with when you never want to deal with it, but certainly not when you're on a trip like this. So you're probably thinking right now, why in the world would I ever take doxycycline? Because, it sounds like there's a lot of reasons not to take it. You have to take it for longer, the potential sun interaction, the yeast infection thing. But basically, the reason is it's really cheap and it works everywhere. There's no resistance. So you're looking at, for an anti-malarial perspective, it is less than $1 a day to take doxycycline. And meanwhile, to take Malarone, it's in excess of $4 a day. So you'd be looking at probably $4 to $5 a day to take that, as opposed to $1. So it really potentially can add up from that standpoint. And then the last one, the mefloquine, is the fourth and final one to talk about from an anti-malarial standpoint. Now, this one has some definite advantages to it in the sense that you only have to take it weekly, like chloroquine. You have to take it weekly, starting 2 weeks before you get there. Take it every week you're there, once a week while you're there, and then 4 weeks after you leave. So super easy to take. It can be a little hard in the stomach. I advise taking it with food. And from a resistance standpoint, there are a few places in Asia where there is resistance to it, but not in most of Africa. This one is okay in pregnancy as well, and relatively inexpensive. But here's the kicker with this one. It can cause some pretty funky side effects that I don't like. So, and they're mostly involving psychological type side effects, things like anxiety. It can cause nightmares. It can do a number on your brain, essentially, in some people. Dear. And so that's a real concern. So we never typically prescribe it to anyone who has any conditions, mental health conditions. And I'm even talking about not even anything terribly active. Like, even if somebody has had a history of panic attacks in the past and they haven't had one recently, I probably would not want to go with it. Same thing with a history of depression. Maybe you're not even taking antidepressants now. Did you take antidepressants for a year, like 5 years ago? Yeah, that's probably enough reason for us not to want to go there. So we don't prescribe it too often. Sometimes we prescribe it for people that are pregnant. And then the other time we sometimes prescribe it is, that one is one we can give to kids in lower doses, and they do not seem to get the weird psychological side effects like the nightmares and stuff. That seems to somehow be reserved mostly for adults. So from the kid standpoint, it's actually not a bad option. And I never really touched on it before, but Malarone can be given to kids, and doxycycline actually can't be given to kids. So I've just talked a lot. Jayden, how about that?
Right. Well, lucky for those kids, they don't get panic attacks from the anti-malarial drugs. But I kind of wanted to talk a little bit more about that. And so you have to take them every time you go somewhere. You don't kind of get lasting protection from them. Is that what kind of the situation is?
Definitely. So once the medicine essentially is out of your system, the protection is gone, right? So people, when they think about malaria, they kind of want to know, do you somehow get vaccinated in some way? No, there's no vaccine. And the medicine, once the medicine's out of your system, that's basically it. You're done. So if you went on a trip and you took one of these medicines, and then next year you went on another trip, well, you'd have to take them again. Yeah, your body doesn't build any of this up. It's like I said, the medicines go out of your system relatively quickly. And certainly when you are talking about Malarone or doxycycline, it's just a matter of days. And with chloroquine and mefloquine, since you only take it once a week, it can push out a little bit longer, but still you're only talking about a matter of weeks.
Right. So do you think that we'll kind of continue on this path of using medicines basically to prevent it? Or do you predict that there's going to be like a longer lasting vaccine in the future? Or do you think that because of the way that the parasites work, that we'll kind of have to just keep matching medicines as we go?
For now, I'd say the vaccine is the holy grail, and they've been working on it for years and years with varying levels of success. There was one product that has been very close to approval. It would not be something that would be practical for a traveler, but more for people that would live in long term in the areas.
Right.
I think we're looking mostly at prevention with tablets and of various sorts, and that will change depending on resistance. I think ultimately increasing bug control methods and that sort of mosquito ridding things will help out a lot. When you think about in a lot of countries, like I'll give you Venezuela as an example. In Venezuela, while things were good there, they virtually eliminated malaria out of most areas. That like the malaria map essentially shrunk greatly for Venezuela. But now that Venezuela has kind of falling apart socioeconomically and politically, they're already starting to see the malaria map is starting to get bigger again, because guess what? Mosquito control methods or measures have really been, the country's not really functioning too well to start with. Never mind spraying for mosquitoes and making sure that you're getting rid of standing water. So they're already starting to see more of a comeback of malaria potentially there as a result. So you will see one example I would give going sort of in the other direction is Costa Rica. Costa Rica has virtually no malaria now. And when I started doing this a decade ago, there was malaria not everywhere in Costa Rica, but the map was significant. Now it's basically no. And that really has a lot to do with the fact that they've kind of got their act together and they've been able to eliminate mosquito habitat and help out a lot there. Now they've got problems still with things like dengue, but malaria is pretty under control there right now.
Right. So is there anything else that you kind of wanted to mention about malaria before we kind of switch gears and talk about a few other diseases and some other things?
I don't really think there's too much more to add. I could talk about malaria all day. It's pretty interesting stuff. I think the one thing that would be worth mentioning is when it comes down to selecting an anti-malarial, there's a couple things to think about there. One, when you're getting it prescribed for you, whoever's prescribing it should have up-to-date maps about where malaria is a concern. Because for a lot of these medicines, if you only have to take it the day before you get into the risk area, maybe you don't need to take it for the full trip. Like I can give you a good example here is like if somebody is going on a South Africa trip, they're doing South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe. If you're going to spend the first week of your trip in Cape Town and Johannesburg, and you're not going to say Kruger Park until like day 7 of your trip, you don't really need to be on antimalarials the whole time. Just the day before you go to Kruger Park, which is the only place really to speak of in South Africa, which is a real high risk area. So it's good to have that information. And then the other thing is having your choice of antimalarial. Like I'll tell you right now, a lot of times I'll be in a situation with patients and I'll say like, look, all of these medicines work. Well, except for chloroquine if there's resistance, but they work. They work if you take them. It just turns into a matter of, what are you willing to, are you willing to put up with the risk of the side effects for say doxycycline or the cost for Malarone? I've told people right out, I'm like, doxycycline or Malarone, whichever one you want to take, I'll prescribe for you. And they kind of sometimes look at you and say like, well, I get to pick, like, how does that work? But really, when it comes right down to it, if you take it and you take it regularly, they're both going to work. It's just what can you afford, and then what, from a side effect standpoint, can you tolerate and are willing to go with. So that's something that it should be a collaborative conversation with whoever's prescribing it. Yeah, lots of times I'll give patients the option pretty much and say like, I'm good either way, and see where they want to go with on that.
Right. So I guess maybe I do have an additional question, but what about people who say do live in an area full time, that's where they've grown up, whatever, where malaria is quite common? Is it normally you kind of get it and then you have some form of immunity, or are these drugs more common to be prescribed, or what is the situation in that sense?
So when it comes down to it, if you live in these areas, very often what will happen is you will get malaria, and usually as a kid, a small kid. And when you look at incidence of deaths of malaria, the vast majority of the people who die from malaria are little kids, which is pretty sad, but true. So what ends up happening is, though, if you get malaria when you're a kid and you survive it, pretty severe the first time around, but then your body does develop some level of immunity. So what ends up happening if you live in these countries, especially in West Africa, you have a level of resistance. So you could still get malaria, but you're not taking the anti-malarial medicines every day. You can still get malaria, but it kicks your butt, and maybe you need to be off work for a week or so, and you need to get prescribed anti-malarial tablets for treatment. But that's what it turns into. It turns into a nasty week and you're off work for a week. Like, as opposed to say a flu or something like that, it's like, hey, where were you last week? Oh yeah. Well, I got malaria. I went and saw my doctor, took the medicines, laid in bed for a few days. I'm better now. And it rarely turns into a situation where it's life threatening in those circumstances, but it's definitely a thing that you need to deal with. In fact, one of the things that will a lot of times happen in some of these developing countries is, if you ever have a fever, they just default to giving you anti-malarial pills and say, we think you might have malaria, take these. And if it's dengue, well, it won't help, but you'll get better in a few days anyway, hopefully. But if it is malaria, you do need to take that, and you'll get better pretty quickly. Does that sort of answer the question there, Jayden?
Definitely. Yeah. So kind of on that note, I suppose a lot of these give you, like, these mosquito-borne illnesses tend to seem like they give you a fever. So I wanted to kind of chat about some of the other ones that we hear more about now, like dengue, Zika, chikungunya, those types of diseases that are also mosquito-borne, but are kind of becoming more common and that we're hearing about a little bit more now.
Absolutely. So this is a real concern going forward. As far as those illnesses, dengue is the one I'm far more concerned about. Just to give you some perspective, dengue was like a footnote obscure disease 30 or 40 years ago. It wasn't anywhere near as much of a thing, but as urbanization has happened around the world, Aedes mosquito loves the city. It loves garbage and standing water in an empty lot or something like that. So this disease has really boomed, and it is one of the more significant health threats we have right now. So something like dengue is a real concern, and even chikungunya and Zika, to a degree, the same. But what typically happens with those ones is there's an outbreak. It can be very active in a location for a period of time, and then it's somewhat kind of settles down where there's still cases, but not sort of at the same level. But dengue is all the time, regular, and in some areas it can be worse at some times than others, but it's the one which sort of, as a baseline, you would be far more concerned about.
Right. So because they have kind of similar symptoms, do they often get confused for each other? Is that a problem when you're treating them? Does that kind of pose an issue for travelers who maybe might get sick and then feel confused, like they don't know? Maybe
it is not always super easy to differentially diagnose them. All of them have a fever potentially. Here basically is the difference, how I would describe them. Dengue, you get a bad fever. Basically, fever and joint pain. You basically feel like you've got the worst flu you've ever had in your life. And it usually lasts for about a week to 10 days. And that usually is as far as it goes. Very rarely, it can morph into something more serious, and it can be deadly potentially. But in the vast majority of cases, it totally kicks your butt for about a week or so. You don't die, but you wish you were dead. I'll put it that way. I have talked to many people who have had dengue. I'm still waiting for the first person to tell me, oh yeah, I had dengue. It was no big deal. Everybody basically says it's the most horrible thing ever. But the nice thing about dengue, if you want to say there's a nice thing about it, is there tends not to be a lot of lingering effects after essentially the symptoms improve after a week to 10 days.
Right.
Now, when you think about chikungunya, it's actually, the symptoms are typically less severe in the acute phase, the fever and achiness and that sort of thing. But the scary thing about chikungunya is that it can give you longer term arthritis-like symptoms in your joints.
Yes.
And that can persist for weeks or months after the infection. So you don't get quite as sick as you do with dengue, but you can have these lingering problems longer term. And I've talked to people who have had chikungunya, and it's a journey, and it takes quite a while to clear some of this up. In fact, sometimes it doesn't even clear up completely. So it's a concern from that standpoint. And then Zika, realistically speaking, is probably the one that is the mildest if you're anybody but a pregnant person.
Right.
If the illness is probably mild, a couple of days of being sick, and then usually that's as far as it goes. But the problem is, if you're pregnant, we know that the virus can wreak havoc with pregnancy and the fetus and can cause birth defects. And that's what happened a few years ago. And realistically speaking, with Zika, it was a very uninteresting disease until the whole pregnancy thing came up. It was somewhat obscure. There weren't a lot of big outbreaks, and nobody was very excited about it because it's something that most people had no symptoms. And if they had symptoms, it was 2 or 3 days and they got better. And it was very rare for it to turn into something severe. So as a result, it was very poorly understood. What's the big advantage of researching this this disease that doesn't
Right.
do that much? Even though we knew it was a topic that came up before, it's like, how can we know so little about Zika virus? It's like, well, if you were trying to apply for a research grant to study Zika virus, I think that it would probably, if I was granting research money, I would probably say, geez, pick something that is more deadly and dangerous. So this, but then once pregnancy and the birth defects became a thing, well, that changed very quickly. But that's kind of why we knew so little about it before that happened. It was wholly uninteresting from that standpoint.
Right. Yeah, I can tell you, I've never been pregnant, but I was terrified of Zika when it started to become a problem and we were hearing more about it kind of in the US and that sort of thing. But one disease that I actually didn't even know existed before I started working with you is chikungunya. And I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who is actually from Venezuela, and she told me that her entire family got it and her grandma still has joint pain from it.
Yeah, I believe that. I can think of a couple patients that I've actually seen who've come back and had chikungunya, and yeah, it's a thing for sure. It's not really common, but it is something that has happened. And despite best efforts of bug protection and that sort of thing, it can happen, and it's nasty.
Yeah, it is. It sounds terrible. So,
Yep.
On that note, since those types of diseases, these Zika and dengue and such, aren't vaccine preventable as of yet, this kind of like, what should people be doing in terms of safety practices when they're traveling to kind of prevent themselves from getting these diseases?
So I guess the most important thing is common sense bug bite protection method. As far as, bug spray, you always want to look at that when you're out and about doing things. Your risk is lower when you're inside more in air conditioned enclosed settings. So more when you're out and about. If you are staying in a situation where you have open windows or you're staying in open air setups, camping, your risk is absolutely higher. And then you need to start thinking about mosquito nets. I typically would say if I'm going even to a high risk malaria country, I'm going to Kenya, but I'm staying in a nice hotel that's enclosed and air conditioned, I'm not going to be putting up a bed net.
Right.
I don't see the point in that. But if you were in an open air situation, a camping situation, absolutely, that's something you would want to look at. And the other thing is clothing. You want to make sure that you've got proper clothing. There's some clothing has mosquito resistant insecticides already put into it, or you can add it in. That's an option. And then the other, just a physical barrier in general. When you start thinking about kids, for example, even like really little kids, you can't do bug spray for 6 months and under 6 months. So
Right.
Their really physical barrier is really the key. That's your main option.
Right. So when we think about bug spray, should someone pick a good one? What should you kind of be looking for when you're shopping for one?
So I really look at 2 active ingredients that are my go-tos. DEET is, tried and true. 30% DEET is sort of the gold standard right now. It's the highest strength you can buy in Canada. And It's the one that World Health Organization says sort of is the sweet spot. It has enough in it to help you out in most higher risk areas. And so, you can't argue with DEET. It's been around forever, but it has a couple disadvantages to it. And I think, the obvious one is aesthetically, it's stinky and greasy. And
yeah.
So I don't love it from that standpoint, but it does work and it's hard to argue with success. But the one I've been seeing more and more, and I've been recommending more and more, is this product called icaridin or picaridin. So this is an anti-mosquito medicine that's been around the world for decades. And I have no idea why, but it has only been approved in Canada, I don't know, like maybe 5-6 years ago at this point. Since we opened the clinic, it was approved because we didn't have it when we first opened, and now we sell lots of it.
Right.
But it works just as well as DEET. It smells better. It's not greasy. It doesn't have, it's much more aesthetically pleasing. It's probably a little more kid-friendly as well. We know with DEET, depending on how young your kids are, sometimes you want to look at lower concentrations. With this one, you just use the regular 10% concentration for everybody. And yeah, it's really become my go-to preferred option. There are lots of other mosquito sprays out there. Really, those are the two best ones. There are some other ones out there that, contain other ingredients. Now, some of them are more useful than others, but I think generally speaking, these are the two that you really want to go with.
Right. Are there any kind of other good practices to keep in mind? Anything to do with the bug spray that you should be doing? How often should you be applying the bug spray, actually?
So you want to reapply more often than it says on whatever it is on the label, because
Right.
you're sweating, you're going in the water. So, I think reapplying on a regular basis, just the same with sunscreen, every few hours, depending on how much you're sweating, is probably a bit more reasonable. That would be the approach I'd take. As far as applying areas, there's some of these come in sprays and lotions. You just want to make sure that you do your best to. Sometimes you need maybe someone to help you get parts of your back or whatever, that sort of thing. But yeah,
Right.
That's what you're looking at. And yeah, I think just do the best you can and reapply reasonably often. And generally speaking, like unless you're reapplying every 15 minutes, I don't think you're going to go too wrong by erring on the side of caution and applying, somewhat regular.
Right. Okay. Anything else you wanted to mention about mosquitoes, mosquito-borne illnesses, bug sprays, anything like that?
I guess one thing I will add in, because it comes up and we get asked this on a somewhat regular basis, there is this product called permethrin, and permethrin is used to, you can spray clothes with it, and essentially it will kill mosquitoes, and it's excellent for doing that sort of thing. So one of the things that can happen, and people read about this, and is that they want to treat some of their clothes with this permethrin. Well,
Right.
Here's the thing. It's not legally available in Canada for that purpose. You can't go and buy that stuff and, our clinic or at an outdoor store like, Mountain Equipment or something like that. It's not legally available in Canada. Now, it's legally available if you go to a store in the States. You can go to I can't remember the name of that store that's, it's kind of like a Mountain Equipment co-op in the States. And you can go in there and buy it off the shelf, no problem. But it is not approved in Canada. But there is one way to get permethrin soaked clothes in Canada. There are a couple retailers that I believe it's Mark's Work Warehouse is the one I'm familiar with, and we are not doing ads for them per se. There's no money changing hands here, but I know that they have some products, and they gave them some kind of brand name, Zero something or other, but they do have products that are permethrin like pre-done into the clothes. So that is the one way in Canada that you can access it. It's not the soak yourself option, but that is a way of doing it. And my daughter, my 8-year-old, we joke around that she must have sweet blood or something, because the mosquitoes just love her. I've never seen anything quite like it. We actually got her one of those shirts, and it's like an adult shirt. Basically, it looks like a quasi dress on her, but it definitely helps. And she wears it in the evening when we go camping, and I think it definitely makes a difference. She loves it. She's convinced it works, and I think it probably helps a bit for sure.
Well, that's good. Yeah, I can't say that I've ever gone into a Mark's Work warehouse and seen children's clothes, but that's good that works. It's interesting. Why is that not approved kind of for like buying off the shelf in Canada? Is there a reason for that, or is it just Health Canada hasn't gotten around to it? Or
your guess is as good as mine. I don't know. It would probably fall into the same category as why did it take decades for iCaritin to be approved in Canada? I don't know. My understanding with, iCaritin, and, I don't know this for sure, but one of the things with iCaritin is I don't think anyone bothered to submit it because nobody has a exclusive patent on it. So I think that what ended up happening with iCaritin is Health Canada decided to do a review on it, even though it wasn't submitted, because most of the time when you're talking about a medicine, a vaccine, somebody has a patent, and then they put in the application and pay for the application and provide the data and say, here's our new product, approve it, please. And it costs money and time and effort and submitting research, and it happens. But when you have a product like this, which nobody really owns it, I think that nobody really ever applied. And I think that's the best theory I have on that one. And I think Health Canada ended up deciding that they should just do a review on it on their own, because it was such a useful thing to have around and we needed to have it. And they basically rubber stamped it and said, yeah, and we consider this to be an acceptable mosquito repellent and go with it. And now in Canada, there are several manufacturers and suppliers of that product. But like I said, I think that's the reason. And I also think that's the reason permethrin's never been approved here either. But that's the best answer I have.
Okay, well, fair enough. Anything else you wanted to mention?
No, I think I've covered a lot.
We have covered a lot of ground today, for sure.
This might be the longest podcast.
Definitely.
Depends on how much you edit it, but.
Well, we'll see. Okay, well, thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of the Polaris Travel Health Podcast. A reminder that the information and advice that we provided in this podcast are not a substitute for live medical advice tailored to your itinerary and your medical history. If you have questions or want to book an appointment, please head over to our website, polaristravelclinic.ca. Check us out on Twitter at PolarisTravelRx and our Facebook page as well. We hope you'll tune in again with us next week.
Thanks, Jayden.
Thank you.